Well, thanks very much, Marie, for this far too generous introduction. So I stand here before you as a symbol of everything that's gone wrong with Norway, okay? So I hope you can bear with that, and that we'll have some good objections and disagreements when I'm finished. I'm going to try and connect my lecture a bit with some of the earlier plenaries that we've been hearing. Yesterday evening we heard about accelerated change, about how certain changes that we associate with modernity somehow have caught up with other changes and have led to an extraordinary growth in a number of areas. Recently, I'm going to touch upon that a little bit. Earlier yesterday, Kate Pickett spoke about trust, and in fact she singled out the Scandinavian societies as societies where there was still a high level of trust, and got a very interesting question from the audience during the Q&A, when someone asked, isn't cultural homogeneity in some ways, or couldn't it be seen as a condition for trust? And that's one of the things that I'm going to discuss later in this lecture. And earlier today, I mean, we had a lecture about reactions to perceived vulnerability. So all of this will go into what I'm going to say about blame and trust. I'm a traditional teacher, okay, so I don't use any visuals, so just sit back and relax, and I'll read my paper. Okay. Across the world, there is a widespread feeling that we live in a time of transition, although there's no general agreement, whether among social scientists or others, as to what kind of transition and what will be its ultimate outcome. We have no clear narrative about the future. Indeed, one often gets the impression that we don't even have a clear narrative about the present, how the world came to be the way it is at the moment. And there seems to be no general agreement about what or who to blame for the negative changes and what to do about the consequences. No general agreement. Of course, there are bids, there are opinions, there are views, there are analyses, but they don't always converge. Accelerated change can be identified in a number of areas. The most familiar exponential growth curve in the last century was that of global population growth. I remember myself, reading the Club of Rome publications in the 1970s, and then they had all these sort of nice little exponential growth curves, showing how many we are now compared to what we were 200 years ago. At the beginning of the 20th century, global population stood at about 1.5 billion. By the end, it had grown to nearly 7 billion, while it took humanity a couple of 100,000 years to reach the first billion. It subsequently took only 2 centuries to increase sevenfold. Yet, if we limit ourselves to the last few decades, accelerated change is more perceptible and arguably more dramatic in a number of other areas. Take, for example, world energy consumption, which has more than doubled since 1975. That's within living memory. The consumption of fossil fuels grew much faster in the 20th century than world population, and the growth rate at the moment shows no sign of slowing down. Today, humanity uses 28 times as much energy as we did at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Or we could look at tourism. Just take another example. Already in the late 1970s, there were people here in Northern Europe complaining that the Spanish coast was being spoiled by excessive tourism. But at the time, Spain received only 15 million tourist arrivals annually, compared to 60 million now. Globally, we may reach a billion tourist arrivals this year. Or you could take the number of international NGOs, anything to do with information technology and computers, commercial flights, the number of the acres of tropical forest destroyed, or the number of people living worldwide in urban slums or in urban areas. There are more of us, and each of us is, on the average, more mobile and active, and has more connections with others, is hooked up to more networks than ever before. So, in general, now I'm still speaking, this is still the headline, okay? I still haven't gone into, as it were, particular places in the world, because the world consists of places, so I'm still speaking. Very generally, earlier eras, seen as a whole, were, without exception, slower eras. In this sense, it can be said that we now live on an overheated planet. I'm not talking about temperature as such, although it's tempting, considering the weather in London these days, which is fantastic. Not just temperature. In physics, heat is simply a synonym for speed, and translated into the language of social science, overheating may refer to accelerated change. You know, if you rub your hands together like this, they get warm, okay? We do that sort of thing a lot where I live, you know, in Oslo, okay? And if you do it really fast, if you can do it really fast, they'd eventually burn up. So speed and heat are two sides of the same coin. And moreover, we've long been aware that the changes brought about by modernity have unintended, often paradoxical consequences. And when changes accelerate, so do the unintentional side effects of change. So that's one take on the lack of an overarching hegemonic narrative about the present age. In research on transportation, it has been argued that there are really just three kinds of road traffic. You have free flow, synchronized flow, and traffic jams. So, I mean, with free flow, I mean, you can change lanes on the highway without looking in the mirror because there are hardly any other cars. And it reminds me of something that was said about the beginning of the Anthropocene, or the beginning of the fossil fuel era 200 years ago. When we were only about 1 billion, James Lovelock once said that, you know, at that time we could do pretty much as we liked, and Gaia would recover. The planet would somehow be able to deal with it. Whereas nowadays, we no longer have an age, as it were, of open frontiers and unexplored wildernesses. Today the situation is quite clearly one of at least synchronized flow, where there is so much traffic on the highway that you need to take a cautious glance in the side mirror before you change lanes. In this kind of world, there is an obvious perceived need for traffic rules, witnessed in the rise of the environmentalist movement, while nature was always culture's other, defined as the opposite of culture, and often as its antagonist. It became in the latter half of the last century to be perceived around the world as being so weak and vulnerable that it needed the protection of culture to sustain itself. Nature was no longer seen as self-sufficient. The need for new traffic rules can also be observed in a number of other areas. In the past, anthropologists writing about remote peoples did not have to worry overly about research ethics and the possibility that some of their informants might be identifiable and might object to what they said. Today, the anthropologist and the informant inhabit a shared world and have to negotiate their relationship in a totally different way. The Danish cartoon crisis a number of years ago is an even better illustration of the general transition from free flow to synchronized flow as a result of the intensification of networks. From the moment the Muhammad cartoons were published in Denmark in September 2005, it took only a short time before there were riots in Nigeria and demonstrations in Beirut. The somewhat overheated reactions to the Danish cartoons might serve as a reminder for the need of traffic rules in accelerated intercultural communication. Such rules are rarely in place when you really need them. Pollution cannot be regulated before it exists. Overheating effects, that is to say, the way I use the term anyway, overheating effects, local reactions to accelerated change, can be observed almost everywhere in the world, but in different domains and of course expressed very differently due to huge variations in local circumstances, both material and symbolic and social. Typically, people perceive that some change or another is taking place really fast. However, they may reflect, nobody asked me for my opinion. Why is this happening? Who should I blame? Who can I trust? And what can I do? In a situation of overheating, this is an emblematic reaction. An obvious task for social scientists, the way I see it, consists in exploring the blaming structures at work locally, a kind of research with obvious political implications. For example, it makes a great difference whether people blame a who or a what. It also makes a difference whether they can blame a local or domestic entity, a person or an institution, or whether the blame for your problems lies abroad. In upland Sierra Leone, when an unexpected change happens, I mean, say, for example, overnight a huge biofuel plantation appears just across the river with Chinese workers. People might shrug and say, it's the global, you know, when you ask people, I mean, what's going on there? I mean, this biofuel plantation, what's happening? Well, you know, man, it's the global. Now our job in that case would consist in unpacking that term. What exactly do they mean when they say is the global? What do they mean by the global? And how is that connected to the world in which they live? And to their worlds of experience and prospects and so on. And the worldview in a very literal sense. Your worldview could be your view of the world, your view of the global. And, for example, if the water shortage in a town somewhere in the Andes can be attributed to a nearby mining company, that mining company can be held accountable. But if the cause is not the resource use associated with mining, but global climate change, it can be far more difficult for the locals to know what to do. They might even begin to look for a local scapegoat. One generic characteristic of overheating is the lack of predictability. There seems to be no script guiding humanity into the next stage, as it were, of modernity. And as I said, no hegemonic narrative telling us where we're going. And in many parts of the world, we're increasingly finding ourselves trapped in a double bind between sustainability, ecological sustainability, that many of the talks at this conference has been about on the one hand, and economic growth on the other. And it often seems that you can't have it both ways. Although ambivalence is a widespread feeling when we're faced with accelerated global change, both as scholars, I think, and as citizens. And it's not just here. It's also clear that there's a great demand for simple answers to complex questions. Both religious fundamentalism and atheist intolerance exemplify forms of cognitive closure, which may be seen as responses to this uncertain situation. And perhaps, let me just throw this out for now, and I'll try to substantiate it a bit later on, okay? Perhaps openness and closure, in social terms, can be seen as two opposing responses to uncertainty and accelerated change. I'm going to return to this in a little while when I discuss my main empirical example. See, I'm doing this in a sort of a backward way. I mean, anthropologists always, or usually, begin by presenting their empirical material, and then they do the analysis. I do the theoretical reflection first, okay? And then the example comes afterwards. We just see how it goes. And I'm coming to the main empirical example in a little while, which is reactions to blaming structures associated with the terrorist attack in Norway about 2 years ago. But I'd like to think first a little bit more systematically about structures of blaming and their relationship to other aspects of social reality. Blaming presupposes a sociology, however rudimentary, or a cosmology, that is, an underlying order against which aberrations and deviations can be understood. Finding out where to place the blame is necessary in order to decide what to do, in order to reinstate a stable situation and to punish the culprit or culprits. Who or what is blamed when something goes wrong, moreover, determines the kind of reaction. So it's not a trivial thing, who or what we blame, as we know. In an important essay published a number of years ago on risk and blame, Mary Douglas distinguishes between three forms of blaming. When, for example, a woman dies in the kind of African society with which she was familiar, accompanied by different reactions by society. First, the woman might have been to blame herself. She could have offended the ancestors or broken a taboo. In this case, the redressive act from the community would be one of purification and expiation, meant to ensure the future obeyance of rules and norms. It's her own fault that she died, because she broke the rules. Secondly, the blame could be attributed to an individual adversary or a competitor within the community, in which case the reaction might be that of compensation according to some kind of tit-for-tat justice. Finally, thirdly, the cause of the woman's death might be located outside the community, from someone who doesn't respect local norms and could represent a subversive, disruptive force. It doesn't have to be someone actually from outside the community. It could be a hidden traitor, you see, inside. Douglas mentions communal punishment and demands for compensation as typical reactions, but she might have added war or cessation of relations, depending on the perceived gravity of the death inflicted. It's perfectly possible to identify similar structures of blaming in contemporary societies. When something is perceived to go wrong, it could ultimately be the victim's own fault, or it could be the work of insidious outside forces, or it could be the result of conflict, contradiction, or competition. So while I was listening to Stephen Collier earlier today, talking about social versus systemic vulnerability, I was thinking also about the parallel with two of Mary Douglas's standard forms of blaming structures. Now Douglas may in her time have underestimated, being a card-carrying structural functionalist, she may have underestimated the degree of disagreement and conflicting perspectives in the traditional societies she mainly wrote about. But it's beyond doubt that in a complex society, several blaming structures are at work simultaneously. And indeed, much of the competition for scarce resources and many ideological conflicts can be understood against differences between different blaming structures. I mean, surely these blaming structures often appear in complex and confusing ways in contemporary societies, characterized as they are by proliferating risks, environmental, economic, social, cultural, and widespread insecurity about the future. The belief in progress, crucial to evolutionary thinking, and an ideological linchpin of capitalism, has been weakened perceptibly almost everywhere in the last decades, largely as a result of the continuous onset of unpredictable crises, which seem to have been produced in the final instance by the system itself, but which nevertheless inspire a whole range of different blaming structures. Mary Douglas states, quote, "There are communities barely earning the name, which are not organized at all. Here, blame goes in all directions, unpredictably," unquote. The situation in contemporary complex societies, the kind of society in which you and I live, may perhaps be described as intermediate between this and extremes of the borderline case, okay, of fragmentation on the one hand and that of the cohesive moral community on the other, where there is by and large agreement about whom to blame and what to do. Let me give you a few more brief examples before I move on to the main case. I think we have time for that. For example, who is to blame for mass unemployment and the informalization of labour, which is taking place in many parts of the world, not least in southern Europe and in other parts of Europe, but also in the Caribbean. In some of the banana-growing islands in the Caribbean, some of those small developing island states, there has been a tendency recently that certain politicians have attributed the weak performance of the industry on the laziness of the banana farmers. They're lazy, that's why they can't make a profit growing bananas. The latter may, in some cases, blame neoliberalism, since the quotas and the guaranteed minimum prices for bananas from the Eastern Caribbean in the European Union were abandoned some years ago. So they lost the quotas, they lost the preferential treatment from the European Union, with dismal consequences for banana producers, whose competitive disadvantage vis-à-vis the larger scale banana plantations in countries like Costa Rica already constitutes a serious handicap. So, in other words, it's yourself, it's because you're lazy, you don't work hard enough, on the one hand. Or on the other hand, no, it's global neoliberalism, and our politicians did nothing about it. The two blaming structures reveal what we may think of as two opposing social ontologies, one which blames the victim and individualizes social processes, and one which points to underlying systemic forces. They correspond with two of Mary Douglas's blaming structures. And the third one is missing, the one that attributes blame to an internal competitor or adversary. But it's not unthinkable, as I suggested, that the relative failure of the banana producers might be blamed on lack of priorities among the politicians. So then you have the third structure as well. The economic crisis affecting many European countries, which now face large-scale unemployment and uncertain prospects, has also been explained in a number of ways. Seen from the position of the new precariat, the informalized labour force, which lives in a state of notorious insecurity, three typical explanations are invoked. First, the fact that a person does not have permanent employment could be said to be his own fault. He may have inadequate qualifications, he may have made professional mistakes in earlier jobs, or he hasn't marketed his skills in a sufficiently aggressive way. Secondly, the situation may be blamed on unwanted competition from within. For example, foreign workers who are prepared to work under worse conditions than yourself. I mean, at my faculty, okay, the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Oslo, they're now again, they're building, okay, they're sort of renovating 3 floors. And they've been doing this continuously since around 1990. But what is new this year is that there's a sign which says something about the security precautions that you have to make before entering the construction areas as a worker. And that sign is in 2 languages, Norwegian and Polish, which was not the case a few years ago. So blame, in other words, in this kind of situation is seen as an implication of a zero-sum game form of competition. Thirdly, the deterioration in working conditions may be attributed to systemic factors, such as deregulation and a generalized neoliberalism, which successfully evades social responsibilities, or perhaps even general incompetence and dishonesty in the political classes. So far, Mary Douglas's simple typology of blaming structures appears to work quite well in a complex society, just as it does in the simpler one, although in our kind of society, all structures of blaming are present simultaneously. We nevertheless need to add an important dimension which is not included in Douglas's analysis. Standard accounts of modernity emphasize a movement from the tangible to the abstract as a constitutive element of the transition from a traditional to a modern society. Trust, notably, is expected to be invested in abstract entities such as laws and state institutions, disembedded science and context-independent knowledge. Morality, similarly, is expected to be based on universal principles, not social relations. The critiques of this kind of dichotomous thinking are familiar and perfectly relevant. And the point is not that trust and blame in contemporary modern societies are de facto associated with abstract person-independent forces and structures, but that there is a widespread cultural assumption that it should be so. Whether this holds for blaming structures as well, I'm unsure. And I'll skip that bit because I'm going to run out of time anyway. But there is this idea that there is a who or there is a what that you could blame. But the what in a traditional non-state society could also be just as abstract as our state institutions, only that it has a more, maybe a more religious aspect. But I'll move on just to another example, just to illustrate again, I mean, the way I think about blaming structures before moving to the example of the terrorist attack in Norway. And the earthquake in Lisbon, which ties in quite well, I think, with Stephen Collier's lecture earlier today, is a good example. Following the earthquake in Lisbon in 1755, at the height of the French Enlightenment, reactions ranged from the religious to the sociological, or proto-sociological, perhaps. The Jesuit priest, Gabriel Malagrida, published a book in the year after the earthquake, where he argued that this was God's punishment, you know, for the many sins committed by Lisbon's inhabitants. Voltaire, the superstar of European intellectual life in the mid-18th century, published a poem about the earthquake, where the inherent argument was that this kind of meaningless disaster reveals the cruelty and immorality of nature, reminding humanity that we're on our own and we cannot blame or trust God when things go wrong. Rousseau, in a long letter to Voltaire, disagreed. He pointed out, interestingly, that although the earthquake was not humanly induced as such, precautionary measures might have mitigated its disastrous effects. A third of Lisbon's population died. For example, Rousseau suggested, a more scattered form of settlement, as well as a kind of early warning system, might have helped to save many lives. Now, these 3 attributions of blame in connection with the Lisbon earthquake correspond quite well with Douglas's types. Malagrida blamed the people themselves. Voltaire blamed an external enemy, nature, while Rousseau suggested that internal arrangements in society itself could at least partly be blamed for the consequences of the disaster. Given the scale of the disaster, it stands to reason that nobody seemed to blame individuals. It wasn't one person, as it were, or 2 persons. But the diversity of the responses to the earthquake, and the different accounts of its consequences bear testimony to a plurality of competing worldviews, and bear some resemblance, which I'm not going into here, okay? We can do it over drinks later this evening, but it bears some resemblance to the typical reactions in Western Europe to the Southeast Asian tsunami of 2004. The current economic crisis in Europe is similarly accounted for by competing and sometimes contradictory worldviews. Blame is attributed to certain persons within the crisis-ridden societies who are depicted as enemies of the people. It could be Greek civil servants, Spanish investment bankers, or real estate agents, or outside the societies in questions. I mean, consider, for example, the widespread demonization of Angela Merkel, especially in Greece. There have been situations where people even blame themselves when the system fails. And I should tell you that there is an idea in Norway and Sweden that although we seem similar from the outside, we're really very different. So Norwegians would say that if the state tells the Swede to do something, he'll do it right away. Whereas if the state tells the Norwegian to do something, he reacts with a very sort of, in a very angry way. He organizes petitions, he writes angry letters to the newspaper, and he rants about this horrible state which tries to force him to do something that he really doesn't want to. And then he does it. Okay? That's the difference. So in Sweden, in the early 1990s, Sweden has changed quite a bit since the early 1990s. But in the early 1990s, when Sweden went through a severe economic crisis, which led to the devaluation of the Swedish krona, substantial unemployment, and a real decline in living conditions for many Swedes. Very few Swedes blame their own political and economic elites, or foreign capitalists, or even immigrants offering cheap labour. Instead, the general identification with the system was so strong that many Swedes felt that they themselves had failed, since no clear contrast was made between state and society. State and society are almost synonymous, or were, between the people and the elites. Blaming structures relating to climate change reveal a similar pattern, which again corresponds roughly to Mary Douglas's division. Many members of the Western middle classes tend to place the blame on themselves or their neighbours for their unsustainable lifestyle. Others blame their own elites for not acting upon the existing knowledge. Yet others blame external forces, technology, neoliberalism, world capitalism, the Americans, the Chinese, the Jews, which come across just as nihilistic as Voltaire's godless nature, but which are nevertheless unintended aggregate consequences of human agency for which we are collectively ultimately responsible. Again, others deny the existence or the reality of climate change and blame international organizations, governments and scientists for keeping the truth from the public. So in general, perhaps we can say, I'm just trying this out now, okay? Perhaps we can say that the more distant and the more abstract the responsible for misfortune becomes, the more difficult it is to act upon one's assumptions about what or who to blame. So it can be quite convenient as a kind of lightning conductor to blame climate change for this, that or the other. And it can also, for this very same reason, feel necessary to personalize blame, to reduce the scope and complexity of a phenomenon in order to make it manageable. Finding someone to blame, someone to punish, an irrelevant course of action in the midst of a situation which is de facto too difficult, too complex, too painful to deal with properly. So I now move finally to my main example. Am I doing okay with time?
Yeah.
Good, yeah. Okay. So, I now move to my main example after these preliminary reflections. Don't worry, I'm not going on for another 45 minutes. About blaming structures and about the sort of individualization of blame, something in society or something external, as the three sort of main forms of blaming. And there's also a tangible, abstract, concrete, abstract distinction here which might be interesting regarding what to do. Who can I blame, who can I trust, and what can I do? Most of you, or all of you, would remember, some of you vividly, some of you more vaguely, the terrorist attack on Norway a little more than 2 years ago, on the 22nd of July 2011. It was at the height of the holiday season in Norway that the news came about a large explosion in the city centre. Early reports indicated that it had been caused by a bomb, although one commentator, in fact a political philosopher and an expert on Islam and human rights, who was brought into the TV studio on short notice, so he was there on that afternoon. Everybody turned on the TV sets, you know. Everybody was on holiday, but they turned on the TV sets if they could, or they went on the internet. And he suggested, this political philosopher, that it might have been caused by an explosion in a gas pipe, as there were currently roadworks in the area. But virtually everybody else immediately directed suspicion towards Muslim extremists. Libya was mentioned, as was naturally that nearly mythical Al-Qaeda network of Islamic terrorists. During the afternoon, reports came about ordinary Muslims being harassed across the country and blamed for the explosion in central Oslo. I mean, I heard a story about a 9-year-old boy in Sandefjord, which is a proverbially, you know, idyllic little town 100 kilometers south of Oslo, and it came into a tobacconist, as we used to call those little shops, to buy some chewing gum, and was blamed by the owner for the terrorist attack. So this kind of thing happens. It was his fault because he was Muslim. Sharing a religion with the suspected terrorists was, as is so often the case with Muslims in Europe, considered to be enough. Yet, by nightfall, news reports about the massacre of young Labour delegates at Utøya, again a proverbially idyllic and somewhat dull island on a lake, less than an hour's drive from the city, suggested that militant Islamism might have little to do with this assault on Norwegian society. Because why should Al-Qaeda or Libya attack young Labour teenagers? As soon became known, the perpetrator of both acts of terrorism, which left 77 dead and dozens wounded, was a right-wing extremist, convinced that multiculturalism in general, and Muslims in particular, were inimical to Norwegian nationhood and destructive of the fabric of Norwegian society. When the facts of the terrorist attack had been established, a vivid and prolonged discussion began in the media and in its extensions in cyberspace, concerning the future of trust and the question of blame. No single hegemonic blaming structure could be discerned. The terrorist, who was, a white Norwegian boy with a middle-class background from the western suburbs of Oslo, was an anomaly in a society where dramatic events of this kind were almost unheard of. And there was no established narrative, about this kind of attack. The Norwegian public sphere has at its disposal a range of narratives blaming foreigners for the ills suffered in the country, with those of the German Nazis and Islamic terrorists at the forefront. Although, as a matter of fact, no Muslim terrorist act has actually been committed on Norwegian soil. There was no readily available narrative about a homegrown anti-jihadist turned violent. Indeed, the police soon admitted that they hadn't even kept right-wing groups under surveillance at all, concentrating their efforts by looking at Islamists. This is why I think that the case of the Norwegian terrorist attack is appropriate in the context of an analysis of responses to accelerated change, because it was something new, it was something unheard of, and it was an instance of a profound sense of insecurity. One blaming narrative that emerged very shortly after the attack individualized the events and pathologized the terrorist. His ideological affiliations were ignored, and he was considered basically a psychiatric case. In fact, the first forensic psychiatrists to examine Breivik concluded along those lines, that he was mad. This structure of blaming avoids a critical interrogation of aspects of Norwegian society by focusing solely on the terrorist's mental state. It also implies that similar attacks could in principle happen any time, and that they could take place anywhere, and it implies no specific course of action. An acclaimed book about Breivik that was published less than a year ago by a highly respected writer focuses exclusively on this track, on his childhood, his mother, his absent and authoritarian father, his identity as a loser from the West End, all his friends, they went on to become lawyers and economists, and they had careers, and he never even finished secondary school. So, in other words, an individualist narrative of this event. Another narrative, which surfaced only this summer, as part of the Conservative Party's election campaign, targeted Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg by using his role in not preventing terrorist attacks to question his leadership abilities. So it was said, I mean, by some supporters of the Conservative candidate for the premiership, that in fact his leadership abilities were weak, and that the attack might have been prevented, and that more urgent action would have been, taken afterwards with a stronger political leadership. So that's another individualizing narrative, which again dodges the question of the politics of the attack. So what these two accounts have in common is their ability to deflect attention, like a lightning conductor. I think the metaphor of lightning conductor can often be useful when we think about blaming structures. Deflecting attention from any societal or cultural cause of the terrorist attack. The first explicitly by locating the cause of the attack to Breivik's childhood, the second by shifting the floodlights to the person of Jens Stoltenberg. He was wise enough not to respond to this provocation, but he might have. A third blaming narrative focused on the inadequacies of the police. They should have been able to identify Breivik as a security risk before it was too late, some said, while others added that the police were far too slow and inefficient in reacting when they learned about the shootings at Utøya. According to this narrative, technical solutions, an improvement of the organizational infrastructure of the state would make a decisive difference in the future. So again, within this structure of blaming, nothing is said about the politics, but the concept of trust was essential. Trust in the protective capacities of the police, the critics said, must be re-established. But terrorism, according to this narrative, it's like an Asian tsunami or a Lisbon earthquake. It may appear suddenly and out of nowhere, and it can therefore best be prevented through a technical solution. Similar to keeping Mexicans out of the USA by building a wall along the border. A fourth blaming structure, I've got three, okay? A fourth blaming structure places the blame mainly on violent online computer games. It was occasionally pointed out in the weeks and months after the terrorist attack that Breivik had in fact